Artists' images of Greek mythology speak to us of an ancient culture which endures today. Dr. Ellen Reeder, curator of ancient art at Baltimore's Walters Art Gallery, sheds light on women's roles in ancient Greece. Pandora's Box.
Over the last few decades, we've acquired a new lens with which to look at classical Greece. Fueled by advances in anthropology, psychology, social history, and even sociobiology, we ask different questions, and we are better able to identify and interpret the answers. We are now ever more mindful that the classical period transmitted and rearticulated stories, rituals, motifs, metaphors, and images that were already tens of thousands of years old. We now realize that ways of thinking traditionally identified with 5th century Greece have actually characterized human thought for much of human existence. Although Greek poets and artists were male, we can very definitely hear the voice of ancient Greek women. We have objects that women dedicated in sanctuaries, and we have works of art that were intentionally created to please women, especially as wedding gifts. We know a great deal about rituals that were observed exclusively by women, and that were thus perpetuated voluntarily by women because these rituals spoke directly to their needs. We also have myths that so specifically address female dilemmas that women surely transmitted and drew comfort from these stories. The many myths that take up the process of resistance and reconciliation as a maturing girl moves to marriage and motherhood would not have survived had they not spoken poignantly to the painful and widespread dilemma of a young girl's forfeiture of individuality and freedom before what was perceived as the greater need of the group. To the argument that women were socialized to believe what they did, we can reply that so also were men. What is noteworthy and thought-provoking about this socialization process is not therefore that it existed, but how methodical it was. A young girl's steps to womanhood were defined through specific ritual roles and dramatic stories of goddesses and mythical heroines, all of which clarified expected patterns of behavior. Although deprived of a public life, women received support and guidance within a community of women, and they found affirmation and self-confidence in the belief that they enjoyed the special protection of all-powerful female divinities. This exhibition looks at two age-old metaphors for women that pervade Greek myth, ritual, and custom. The first metaphor likens a woman to a vessel or container, and it dominates the stories of Pandora, Danae, Persephone, and Erichthonius. The image is probably derived from the perception of Earth as a womb. The metaphor brings to women other properties that an image of enclosure suggests, including concealment, withholding, mystery, and treasure. The second metaphor likens a woman to an animal of the wild. The most prominent examples are Thetis, Atalanta, and Artemis. As the equivalent of an untamed animal, a woman was believed to be instinctively knowledgeable about biological processes in the nurturing of the young, but in need of socialization to adapt to man-made institutions of community life. Like a domesticated animal, she was regarded as ever harboring impulses to revert and therefore subvert society. In classical Greece, the concentration of these ways of thinking about women center on the Parthenos, the physically mature young woman who had not yet married. In Greek culture, this girl was between the ages of about 11 and 14 and was characterized then as today as exuberant, spirited, and independent-minded to the point of being uncontrollable. Mythical heroines are invariably Parthenoi, as are the unmarried virgin goddesses Athena and Artemis. Profound awe and anxiety surrounded this sexually available and fertile young woman, whose commitment was essential to the survival of the community. Numerous myths and rituals address the apprehension that a Parthenos will indulge her sexual curiosity prematurely, or will irresponsibly employ her most irresistible weapon, her gaze, which Alcman declared could liquefy a man, such heat did it emanate. Some myths express the anxiety that a young woman will reject society's values altogether, as did the Amazons, or undermine marriage and motherhood like the Maenads. This maiden belongs to a series of marble statues that were discovered during excavation of the Acropolis at the end of the last century. Inscribed statue bases tell us both that the statues were known as chorai, little girls, and that they were dedicated to Athena, who was addressed in the inscriptions as the Chore of Zeus. Chori functioned in the archaic period as both grave markers and votive dedications. A chore is regularly identified by inscription as an agalma, an object of delight. Also identified as agalmata were sculptures of horses, and horses with riders. Scholars persuasively argue that the designation of the chori as agalmata can be explained by a woman's role within Greek culture. She was viewed as a commodity, an object of exchange, because her fertility was a highly valuable asset, as were her dowry and the skills, such as weaving, that she brought with her to the marriage.
The behavior and demeanor expected of a respectable woman could be summed up by the terms aidos and sophrosune. Aidos can be translated as respectful modesty with strong overtones of sexual shame. Sophrosune signifies discretion and dignity. Plato defined the term as doing everything in a quiet and orderly way. A woman exhibiting aidos and sophrosune would be modest, submissive, and passive. Moreover, she would not speak. Aristotle quotes Sophocles as saying that silence is a woman's glory, and Plato comments that the woman's mouth was to be closed, speaking only to her husband. The primary way in which a woman could express aidos and sophrosune was by inclining her head and lowering her eyes when in public, or in the presence of a man. This comportment was not confined to women. Mature men might adopt the pose in religious context where they considered themselves before the gods, and a young man might also present himself in this manner when in the presence of an older man during a solemn moment. The main difference was that an inclined head and lowered eyes were not expected of a mature man at all times, but were required of a woman who had reached puberty at the age of about 13. A woman's head is often exaggeratedly angled downward, while her eyes, prompted by curiosity, often glance upward as far as is physically possible. Incidentally, in genre scenes in classical vase painting, which show women inside the house in the presence of other women, they neither incline their heads nor lower their eyes. The evolution of classical art witnessed, together with an increased skill in rendering the female body realistically, a parallel sophistication in the development both of a vocabulary of gesture and a subtlety in its usage. In general terms of body language, a woman practicing aidos is characterized by a closed silhouette with arms close to the torso, whereas the hetaira, prostitute, exhibits an open silhouette that artists deliberately render as the diametric opposite. Upraised hands of distress or astonishment, when belonging to respectable women, are intended to catch the viewer's attention because they are so uncharacteristic of a well-behaved female. Through much of the 5th century, a respectable woman is not shown even touching anyone who is older than a baby, while her prostitute counterpart enjoys easy body contact with male customers. Outside of the symposium context, the first expression of affection appears in the depiction of deities in context of mother and child. Aphrodite's embrace of her son Eros, in this impression from an ancient clay relief, is one of the earliest examples. At about the same time, Demeter and Persephone begin to express their rapport more overtly, with Persephone consoling her mother by gently pressing her head and shoulder against her mother's body. Concurrent with gestures of familiarity is a trend towards informality, as shown in this decree relief depicting Athena resting her left elbow on a pillar draped with her aegis. Classical artists not only expanded their command of gestures, they also refined their existing vocabulary. The gesture of the onycholypsis, or the unveiling of the bride, is recognized by the way the fingers of the bride's left hand finger the edge of the mantle or veil in front of her left shoulder. The gesture refers to the moment in the bridal ceremony when, by removing her veil, the bride signals acceptance of her husband and her sexual submission to him. In the course of classical vase painting, the gesture is no longer confined to bridal ceremony. When a Mimone adopts this gesture during her pursuit by Poseidon, it signals her acquiescence to his advance, a message that is reinforced by the strength of her gaze back at him. In the departure scene on this stamnos, the wife has just filled her husband's fiale with wine from her oinakoi, which now hangs at her side. Even though this farewell is potentially a final one, the wife's demeanor toward her husband is remarkably restrained. The wife's head is lowered in the idos, appropriate to a proper Athenian woman. This modesty is further communicated by the gesture of the woman's left hand to draw the bridal veil away from her face. The gesture expresses the wife's allegiance to her husband, but the moment acquires a special poignancy because it is one of perhaps final separation. A particularly interesting gesture that undergoes an adaptation of usage during the 5th century is the handshake, introduced on grave reliefs, to express a bond between the deceased and the survivor. The handshake is introduced into scenes of departure in the later 420s, if not earlier. The first appearances of the handshake are as awkward as they may well have been in actuality. On an amphora from Warsaw, the wife continues to incline her head in the traditional expression of idos. The gesture replaces the fiale and oinakoi previously held by the husband and wife. The substitution is quite significant because the handshake implies an equality between the couple that was not apparent in scenes where the wife prepares to pour wine into her husband's fiale. In this detail from the bell crater, dated at the end of the century, a woman rather aggressively pumps a young man's hand while gazing directly into his eyes. The large number of bridal scenes in classical vase painting tell us much about the ancient wedding, its rituals, and traditions. The bride's dress included a veil draped over her head and shoulders, a piece of fabric that could have a tasseled hem. It had been colored to a yellow-orange with dye from the saffron plant, which was specifically associated with women, probably because of its traditional use as a medication for menstrual ills. The bride also wore a great deal of jewelry. This exquisite and unusual necklace of gold and colored stones is particularly evocative of the finery of the bridal array, because the imagery of the pomegranate has powerful associations with the fertility of the bride and with Persephone, bride of Hades, lord of the underworld, whose marriage endowed mankind with continuing cycles of earthly vegetation. It would have been worn together with the profusion of other golden finery, including bracelets, earrings, and an elaborate bridal crown. In her gold-drenched appearance, the bride would have glowed as a precious jewel herself, decked in gold in accord with her position as a highly valued commodity being brought into her new household. Both bride and groom were outfitted with bridal wreaths made of myrtle, an honor that was otherwise reserved only for victors in battle and in Panathenaic games, and which conferred a superhuman status upon the bridal pair. In vase painting, an attendant, or the bride herself, as shown in this example, may carry the lutrophorus for the bridal bath. And scenes on wedding vases show the bride playing with a baby boy, probably to bring the bride good luck in bearing a son.
At some point in the festivities, the anacalypteria, or unveiling of the bride, took place. The veil was lifted from the bride's head, probably with her own assistance and certainly that of the bride's attendant. The action was an actual and symbolic beginning to the disrobing of the bride, and it is generally thought that the action signified the bride's willing acceptance of her husband as a sexual partner. After the unveiling came the wedding procession to the home of the bridegroom. The bridegroom led the bride by means of the traditional gesture by which her left wrist was grasped firmly by his right hand. In geometric and archaic Greek art, this gesture was one of abduction. It first enters the wedding context with a late 6th century vase by Euphronius, and within the wedding ritual, The gesture is generally agreed to signify the submission of the bride to her husband. Because vase paintings were deliberately created to please the bride, they offer thoughtful insight into the bride's view of the wedding ritual, an occasion when she would be joined for a lifetime to a man she may hardly ever have met and with whom she would immediately have her first sexual experience. It may not be surprising that in the vase scenes we detect no note of intimidation, but rather the survival mechanism of romanticization. A favorite subject on the bridal vases is the moment of unveiling, when Eros hovers enticingly above the couple's heads to indicate that they are spontaneously and irresistibly drawn to one another. Because unmarried girls were almost invisible, and the wife of an Athenian citizen had little contact with men outside the home, scenes from daily life in Greek vase painting rarely portray the interaction of men and women. By contrast, scenes with men and hetairai, prostitutes, are not unusual, and during the first quarter of the 5th century, a popular subject in vase painting was the financial negotiation between a prospective client and an hetaira. In many of those scenes, the customer extends a money bag toward the woman. In a number of these scenes, a wool basket is present, and the only logical explanation is that an allusion to her domestic nature enhanced an hetaira's appeal to a prospective customer. Indeed, since the ideal woman in Greek society was supposed to be beautiful, intelligent, submissive, and industrious, the inclusion of the wool basket specifically addressed this last criterion. The symposium scene on the underside of this kylix presents a very clear picture of how prostitutes conducted themselves. In almost every detail, the behavior contrasts markedly with that of a respectable woman. Outstretched arms and full nudity contrast with the partially draped figures of the men and the greater composure and restraint of the men's gestures. They gaze directly into the faces of their male customers. Not a single woman displays the downcast head and lowered eyes of idols. In contrast to wives and daughters of citizens, this hetaira wears her hair short, curls rakishly framing her face. She gazes directly into the face of her male customer. It's obvious that an hetaira's lack of inhibition was a large part of her appeal to her customer, whose attraction to unconstrained spirits calls to mind the popularity of a metaphor of a woman as an untamed animal, yet to be domesticated.
The things of a woman are the things that are within. The wife is the guardian of the things inside. Keep yourselves nice and clean so that we women can entertain you with the contents of our kiste. Female, having a hollow part.
The logical comparison of a woman's body to a container is well documented in Greek thought. Hippocrates likened the womb to a cupping jar, and the same word, amnion, is used both for the membrane that surrounds the fetus and a vessel for collecting the blood of a sacrificial animal. Aristotle speaks of the womb as an oven, and elsewhere we find the female body correlated with a treasure chamber. A woman's body is also aligned with the earth, which was considered the quintessential womb. In the Greek wedding ceremony, the father of the bride addresses his daughter's new husband by declaring that, "I give her over to you for the plowing of legitimate children." The analogy of a woman to a container permeates everyday customs, rituals, and myths, where we encounter a wide variety of forms of containment. These images can vary from clay vessels to wicker baskets and wooden chests, and also include enclosed rooms in a home and underground storage chambers. Through the metaphor of containment, women and their fertility are ascribed three important connotations: concealment with overtones of withholding, treasure, and mystery, all tinged with sexuality and undercurrents of anxiety.
These two elegant examples by Karinos constitute concrete embodiments of the traditional metaphor likening women to hollow containers created by men from clay. Both vases were discovered in the same tomb in Volchi and are here reunited for the first time. In addition to the variations in decoration and in decorative patterns, the St. Petersburg example is slightly larger. And on the Berlin example, the pupils are in relief, the knobs on the back of the head are linked by chains, and the inscription rather elegantly and proudly extends down the handle. At the time when Karinos created these two, head vases in Athens were not being made of Greek men, but only of women, satyrs, and Africans, all marginal members of society. Perhaps the most compelling mythical example of the vessel as a metaphor for a woman's body is the pithos, storage jar, that Pandora brings with her to Epimetheus. Professor Zeitlin from Princeton University has written that the pithos is an image for Pandora's own body. When she opens the pithos, a host of sicknesses and plagues escape, in keeping with the Greek point of view that children represented a mixed blessing. The fact that hope does not depart, but remains inside the pithos, is also consistent with the optimism with which every new birth is anticipated. In addition to its reference to the life cycle, the metaphor of woman as vessel carried connotations of treasure. The pyxis was a vessel associated almost exclusively with women and was used to contain jewelry, cosmetics, and toiletries. The double doors identify the scene as taking place in the woman's quarters of the house, where women carried out their tasks, represented by the wool basket, spent time with their children, reflected in the presence of the boy, groomed and adorned themselves, to which the hanging sash and chest refer, and enjoyed their leisure hours, to which the bird is an allusion. The darting woman enlivens the composition and accentuates the circularity of the figural band. She is probably also intended to suggest that a woman's world had animated as well as idle moments. The vessels that are particularly associated with women further enrich the expression of the metaphor of containment. Because obtaining water was traditionally a woman's task, the water vessel, or hydria, was viewed by many Greek artists as a specifically female vessel. Not surprisingly, scenes painted on hydria often referred to women's activities, and the distinctive swelling shape was compared with the woman's body. This scene is testimony to the degree to which the artist, the Naiad painter, associated women with chests and doors, imagery whose connotations of enclosure, intimacy, and treasure are particularly evoked in this composition. Not only did the word muhos identify a woman's body and the interior of a house, but the word escara referred to both the central hearth of a house and a woman's sexual organs. The comparison of women with sealed or greatly protected chambers finds a parallel in actual custom. So pervasive, in fact, was the image of women being contained within the house, that ancient writers could speak of women being locked in the women's quarters, and Aristotle could remark that women were accustomed to living a submerged and shadowy existence. In ritual, women were consistently associated with containers. This figurine is of a Pandoras, an unmarried virgin who functioned as a ritual basket carrier in one of the many religious festivals that dotted the Attic calendar. The Pandoras carried on her head a canoon, which was a flat basket with 3 handles. It has been shown that its origins can be traced back to about 1000 BC, and suggests that it evolved from a basket that was used in Bronze Age ritual. The girls, Kanaphoroi, regarded their burdens as an honor and a responsibility intimately linked with their community's own well-being. In another ritual, young girls appointed Araphoroi carried containers with mysterious contents to and from a sanctuary of Aphrodite. Containers pervade the wedding ritual. The bride took her bridal bath using water stored in a vase, the lutrophoros, that was exclusively for wedding use. Another distinctive wedding vessel was the libis gamikos, which surely has its origins in a vessel for food. It was customary to place sprigs of myrtle in the mouth of the libis, obviously to reinforce the couple's fertility.
The close association of women with animals is of extreme antiquity. A goddess depicted in about 6000 BC at Çatalhöyük in southeastern Anatolia was flanked by animals, and an animal's skull lay between her legs as if she had just given birth. The same symmetrical representation characterizes archaic images of the mistress of wild beasts, whom Homer identified with Artemis. the mistress of wild beasts, and surely her ancient ancestor, was viewed as the mother of all animals, both the predators that would destroy men and the game that would sustain them. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, Artemis is hailed as the one who rejoices in arrows and is the shooter of arrows. At the same time, Artemis is the nurturer of the young of wild animals. The goddess was regarded as the fierce protector of animals too young to be hunted, and at the same time an enthusiastic hunter who unhesitatingly kills those same animals when they reach maturity. It is interesting to consider that in Greek thought, the goddess's dual roles were accommodated without difficulty. Artemis was protector of both the hunter and the hunted, because both were necessary to the survival of society. Animals must be allowed to mature and propagate to ensure enough game to sustain the community. Little girls were under Artemis's special protection, and votive figurines variously represent little girls or young animals, poignantly nestled in the goddess's embrace.
In this figurine, the girl's upraised arms and widespread legs suggest a dancing pose, and we are probably to understand that she is participating in a ritual honoring the goddess. The position of the girl's body directly against Artemis' skirt and the gesture of her mother emphasize the maternal, protective nature of the goddess' relationship with unmarried girls. A comparison of this figurine with images of Artemis holding young animals of the wild reminds the viewer of the degree to which young girls were equated in Greek thought with untamed animals. The animal with which women are most closely identified in Greek myth is the bear. The custom by which young girls served as little bears in the cult of Artemis is one of the most fascinating aspects of classical Greek religion. Just before they reached marriageable age, young girls served Artemis as little bears in the goddess's sanctuary at Brauron. Most of our information about the ritual itself comes from vases that have been found at Brauron and in other sanctuaries to Artemis. Young girls, apparently aged between 6 and 13, are identified by their long hair and short stature. They are shown running in the presence of a bear, priestesses, and various appurtenances such as baskets, branches, altars, and palm trees. Sometimes the girls are nude, but occasionally they wear short tunics, and the variation indicates that changes in the clothing played a part in the ritual. The ritual symbolically accommodated the maturing girl's bareness, her sexuality and fertility, to the strictures of marriage and motherhood. The painter of the vase has deliberately drawn the parallel between the fleeing little bears and the hunting scene beneath them, where a fawn is the quarry of the hounds. The correlation of courtship with hunting is well attested in Greek thought, as is the comparison of a girl at puberty with a sacrificial animal. The comparison of young women and animals is also seen in the story of Peleus and Thetis. Thetis turns into various animals in order to avoid the amorous advances of her suitor, Peleus. Here he wrestles with her as she prepares to transform herself into a lion. Because the Greeks were uncomfortable showing the actual metamorphosis of a human into an animal, the artist depicts the lion standing menacingly beside her. The equation of young women with animals is also reflected in the mythical maidens, who are regularly demanded in sacrifice to atone for the killing of a sacred animal. The maidens escape their fate when an animal is substituted in their place. Iphigenia is the most celebrated example. Iphigenia was a Parthenos, a physically mature but unmarried young woman, sacrificed to Artemis by her father, King Agamemnon. In some versions of the story, Iphigenia died on the altar, but in others she was rescued at the last minute by Artemis, who substituted an animal, whether a deer, a goat, or a bear, in her place. Everything about Iphigenia's demeanor suggests that she is unaware of the danger ahead. The painter depicts the moment when Agamemnon deceives Iphigenia into believing that she has been summoned for her wedding to Achilles. Her head is demurely inclined in the prescribed idos, or modesty, of a young maiden, and the fingers of her left hand lift the folds of her veil in the traditional gesture of the bride. Iphigenia appears trustful of her father's grasp of her mantle, unaware of the drawn sword in his left hand, as well as the second sword directed menacingly at her from behind. The palm tree under the handle, which signifies Artemis' sanctuary, reminds the viewer that the goddess has demanded Iphigenia in sacrifice. Agamemnon's glance is also significant. The king chooses to look away with a different kind of shame from the eidos of his daughter. It is not uncommon in classical vase painting to encounter a type of scene in which a youth runs after a fleeing maiden. He may be identified by his attributes as a god or a hero. A weapon may be held in a threatening position or even engaged, or the pursuer may hold spears at his side in an inactive position. Because of the presence in this scene of weapons used in hunting, the viewer is obviously intended to understand that the pursuit of a woman is being likened to the pursuit of a quarry. Subtleties in these scenes show that pursuits are not as straightforward as they initially appear. In many, if not most examples, the woman turns to look back at her pursuer. The interlocked gazes submit the youth to the irresistible erotic gaze of the female. We are led to conclude that through the power of her gaze, the pursued woman is energetically, even with mutual aggressiveness, responding to her pursuer. Sometimes the maiden's gesture reinforces her seeming acceptance of her pursuer, for she may finger her garment in the traditional gesture of the submissive bride. In the lekythos shown here, Poseidon plunges his trident into Anemone's side below her breast, exactly as if she were a fish he were harpooning. In some versions of the story, Poseidon strikes a rock with his trident to create a spring of water for Anemone. Because a mythical link existed between women and life-giving water, Poseidon's action in this scene probably referred to that tradition. However, even if we can explain the action as a metaphor both of courtship and of creating a spring of water, we are left with an image that is soberingly brutal.
A number of mythical females provide graphic imagery for the fundamental Greek anxiety that women could be domesticated only temporarily or not at all, and that women's basic feral nature would inevitably reassert itself. Some of these females are of semi-bestial form and destroy men by means of their words or their gaze. Others have access to superhuman powers of sorcery, or are goddesses who ultimately emasculate their mortal male lovers. Others of these mythical women reject any contact with men at all, or resort to the violent murder of a man when rejected or offended. Perhaps the most frightening women appear to embrace conventional mores, but suddenly, and ostensibly without reason, abandon home and domestic life to kill men and even their own children. The Amazons are one of the most evocative and enduring images of Greek mythology. They refuse to live in an orthodox society with men, and such man-made institutions as marriage, preferring to mate on occasion with men of neighboring communities. The Amazons raised their children by themselves and were said to refuse to rear sons. Accomplished riders, Amazons were closely identified with horses, and many of their names, such as Hippolyte, have equine roots. The Amazons' close partnership with their horses constitutes a graphic example of the pervasive metaphor that likened unmarried girls to fillies who had not yet experienced the harness.
This is a masterpiece of early classical Attic pottery by one of its premier painters. The potent eroticism of the images on this vase is unmistakable in the aggression between male and female on the battlefield, the unconcealed sexuality of the Amazon warriors, and the violent action of the male figure in each scene as he kills his Amazon opponent with a sword thrust to her breast. It is particularly significant that the vase focuses on a conquest by the Greek hero Heracles in territory where the females are in control. The message that comes through clearly is a sense of celebration that the proper Greek social order, with its hierarchy of male over female, has been established. The Maenads of Greek myth are female followers of Dionysus, god of the wine, that sparks their uninhibited dancing and ecstatic trances. They are mortal women who leave their homes to be initiated into sacred bands, while in a temporary state of madness induced by wine or the mesmerizing effects of the aloes or flute. Their uncontrollable state is characterized by their ivy leaf wreaths, animal skin garments, unrestrained dancing, wild gestures, and their association with wild animals and snakes. Maenads were even said to tear animals apart with their hands and then eat them raw, a practice known as omophagy. After the Maenadic trance is over, the women return to their senses and to their everyday lives. Societies of Maenads existed in real life. Greek women would gather to carry out rituals associated with Dionysus and wine. The obvious continuation of the scene as one turns the vase reinforces the impression that we are witnessing the explicit unfolding of a ritual that celebrated the release of spirited impulses through the agency of wine. Eos, goddess of the dawn, was notorious among the Greek goddesses for her unabashedly self-satisfying sexuality. She took a variety of mortal lovers, including Kephalos, Tithonus, Orion, and Cleitos, snatching them from the midst of their manly pursuits to become her consorts in the land of the immortals. The popularity of the myth in Greek thought indicates that the stories of female figures who actively pursue their own pleasures were both arousing and threatening to the Greek imagination. The lyre identifies the pursued youth as the schoolboy, Tithonus. The fate of Tithonus is particularly memorable for its graphic character. As the recipient of eternal life without eternal youth, his aging body eventually became distasteful to Eos, and she finally locked him away forever out of her sight. Here the painter has suggested that the ultimate disparity in their appearance lies far in the future. The painter has omitted her wings and given her the long locks of an adolescent maiden. A note of flirtatiousness is introduced with the gesture of her right hand, which lifts her mantle folds in the manner of a bride unveiling herself for her new husband. Belying these coquettish traits are the goddess's aggressively lunging stride and her firm grip on Tithonus' neck.
No mythical figures better represent Greek anxiety about treacherous women than Circe, the sorceress of Greek mythology. In the Odyssey, Odysseus tells of coming to the island of Aiaia, which is ruled by the goddess Circe, a sorceress. The story resonates with sexual tensions. All of the human inhabitants of Circe's island are female, and any men who attempt to approach her palace are turned into swine and made to guard the island. Because the word for pig in Greek is slang for the female sex organs, Circe's transformation of the men into swine has overtones of emasculation. Circe's oriental garments refer to her Eastern origin. The clothing reinforces her identity as a woman with magical powers, which were usually ascribed to foreigners. The nature of Odysseus' victory is somewhat ambiguous, because Odysseus will stay on Circe's island for a considerable length of time, his journey homeward suspended as he becomes Circe's lover. The sexual currents between the two figures are already apparent as Odysseus and Circe link gazes, their arms and legs practically in contact with one another. Few figures in Greek mythology have received as many and as varied interpretations as Medusa and her two Gorgon sisters, who were distinguished by fangs, snaky hair, and the ability to turn into stone any man who gazed at them.
This Hedria depicts the story of Perseus and Medusa with a comparative wealth of narrative detail, including the sleeping Medusa in a landscape setting. Her physical connection with the tree emphasizes her vulnerability as she sleeps. Perseus advances furtively as advised by his guides Hermes and Athena. The sleeping Medusa, seen here, represents a middle stage between the traditional monstrous Gorgon, familiar from the Archaic period, and the beautiful maiden of the later 5th century. The frontal face is reserved in Greek art for the monstrous and bestial. for the dying, and for otherworldly and liminal beings. Unlike other depictions of the slaying of Medusa, the figures do not avoid looking at her, the implication being it is not simply the sight of the Gorgon's face which turns one to stone, but her active gaze at the beholder. Her latent power is nonetheless emphasized by a large group assembled to overcome her, 3 deities and a hero against a sleeping, seemingly benign creature. An element of amusement enters the scene as the figures approach with exaggerated caution the ugly figure who is both maiden and monster. According to one tradition, Athena guided his hand as he gazed at the reflection of Medusa in his bronze shield. A blow from the sickle decapitated Medusa, and from her neck cavity sprang the winged horse Pegasus. Perseus escaped Medusa's pursuing sisters by using his winged sandals and cap of darkness. Perseus then gave Medusa's head to Athena, who affixed it to the middle of her aegis.
This much-beloved vase narrates with lively charm the episode in Book 12 of the Odyssey, where Odysseus encounters the famous sirens. These bird women lured men to their death by singing of the glory with which men would be celebrated by future generations. The sorcerer Circe gave Odysseus the secret of how to escape the siren songs by stopping up his sailors' ears with wax. Odysseus chose not to use the earplugs himself, but instructed his crew to tie him to the mast so that he would not be able to surrender to the songs and turn the ship toward the shore. Here we see him straining upward to hear the siren songs. While impervious to the sound, the crew rows vigorously ahead, urged on by the helmsman. A single sailor turns around to wonder at his leader's torment, which is so clearly evident in the way Odysseus' chest is thrust outward and his head raised upward to the sky. The plunging siren is clearly collapsed in death, a detail that provides our earliest testimony for a tradition that otherwise survives for us only in a post-classical literary source. If a man successfully resisted the song of the sirens, one of the sirens must die. Especially noteworthy is the gigantic size of the bird women relative to the sailors. The siren's intimidating scale enhances the magnitude of Odysseus' victory, and also implies that an exaggerated scale is necessary to convey adequately the strength of the siren's force. So easy is it to understand how women came to be identified with animals, that it's very likely that this way of thinking originated in the hunting and gathering phase of human existence. It's important to realize that women did not find distasteful the fact that they were compared to animals pursued as prey. Pursuit scenes are depicted on vases given to the bride as wedding gifts, and in pursuit scenes, women return the gazes of their suitors and even adopt a gesture of acquiescence. It's abundantly clear that in the classical period, the concept of a marriageable maiden as an untamed animal to be domesticated in marriage was a positive image, accepted by both male and female. Nonetheless, a young woman growing to maturity in classical Athens was the recipient of a confusing message. She was led to believe that her sexual appeal lay in her feral aspect, and her preparation for marriage concentrated on the socialization of this quality. She was also made well aware that her respectability as a grown woman was closely tied to a life of containment. Her submissiveness was to be manifested in downcast eyes that bespoke a modesty with overtones of sexual shame. If she were lucky, a maturing girl surrounded by these contradictory directives would have learned to achieve the balance that was the guiding tenet of Greek culture.